Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the wonderful Robin Boyd House, where tonight we're celebrating architectural innovation and best practice in design. For those of you that may not know me, I'm Philip Goad. I'm Professor of Architecture and Director of the Melbourne School of Design, the MSD. And I'd like to begin proceedings by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which this event is taking place, the land of the Wurundjeri people, and pay respect to their elders and families past and present. Now, you're in Robin Boyd's house. He played an instrumental role in reconciling architectural and some would argue artistic genius with his clients' needs around the way they live. It's fitting then that we welcome Tony Chenchow here this evening. He's a previous winner of the National Robin Boyd Award for Residential Architecture. He's based in Sydney and with his partner Stephanie Little is revolutionising the way we view the industry within which we work, finding original solutions within traditional constraints. And I'd have to say, Tony's work I became aware of from an article in Architecture Australia, Stanislas Fung's article on the Zertes house. And I always enjoy reading Stan's writing, but most particularly when he's writing about contemporary architecture. And to my delight, the journal continued to publish Chenchow Little's work, and it's fantastic to see it gaining even greater recognition globally. This event this evening is part of our exclusive, exclusive MSD Directors Series, which since it began in 2011 has welcomed outstanding practitioners from across a number of disciplines. We had Timothy Hill here of Donovan Hill last year from Brisbane, and Peter Lovell of Lovell Chen at, I'd say, a much colder Villa Alba. That was a very sort of heritage-related community that joined us for that conversation, which is essentially what these evenings are about. They're deliberately small, they're not open to the public, we've made it a special small event. So deliberately informal, intended to encourage conversation and interaction amongst all of you. But Tony Chenchow, born in Sydney, he graduated in architecture from the University of New South Wales and was the winner of multiple RAIA New South Wales student prizes. He's the founding partner of Chenchow Little Architects with Stephanie Little, and their work has attracted strong interest from international and local publications, including Casabella, Abatari, the Dutch magazine Mark, Architectural Record, Monument, Wallpaper, Architecture Australia, the list could go on. Many of you will have seen their Skylight House recently published in that beautiful journal that the Concrete Association publishes, CA. If you don't subscribe or somehow get it, do. I think it's one of the best things that it's published. And there are brilliant photographs there by John Gollings and Catherine Liu. Chenchow Little has received many awards for their work, as I said before, including the AIA Robin Boyd Award in 2010. In tonight's lecture, Loopholes, Mutations and Precedents, three aspects of a small architectural practice, Tony will discuss how innovation is underpinned by a patient reading of council planning codes within the local Sydney context. He'll also discuss the combination of new and old, how one existing form combined with another can become something entirely different to meet the demands of a new situation or purpose. And finally, he'll go beyond local issues such as codes and clients and turn towards a broad range of international precedents that might be considered in relation to projects that he'll be showing today. So please join me in welcoming Tony Chenchow. Thanks, Tony.
Can you hear me? Am I projecting well enough? Yes. Okay. I would like to start by thanking Philip Goad for the invitation to be part of the MSD series 2012. It gives me great pleasure to present this talk titled Loopholes, Mutations, Precedents, Three Aspects of a Small Practice. In the interest of finishing on time, I've woven the third topic of precedents in the other sections of the talk. Planning codes have played an important role in shaping our suburbs. As the majority of our projects are suburban houses in Sydney, I thought it would be appropriate in this first section of my talk to start with the impact council planning codes have had on our work. In New South Wales, planning codes are divided into two sets of documents: local environmental plans, LEPs, and development control plans, DCPs. Planning codes are neither neutral or objective. I agree with Elijah Hughes, the editor of Perspective magazine, that codes charged with political, social, and formal intent operate as the architecture of architecture, creating its preconditions and shaping its production. LEPs gazetted by the State Parliament are legal documents. They typically deal with zoning, subdivision, and heritage items. DCPs contain prescriptive guidelines such as wall heights, setbacks, envelope controls, floor space ratios, landscape areas, private open space requirements, as well as local character statements. They do not carry the same legal status as LEPs. However, the weight judges in the Land and Environment Court have placed on them has increased over the last 20 years. DCPs in Sydney have become a vehicle for council to impose and project their ideal visual image of the built environment. They have become de facto design codes. Many architects and clients have challenged the codes in the Land and Environment Court. The example of Harry Sadler is well known, but my experience with the Land and Environment Court early in my career was not so successful. I found that consultant town planners on both sides, as well as judges, would make ill-informed design amendments in order to facilitate a consensus. In one case, a judge proudly admitted that he had thought up the solution during his morning shower. I quickly realised that a confrontational approach with council was not productive. We then tried to comply with the objectives of the code. In doing so, we made minor breaches in the numerical standards on the basis of compliance with the code's objective. This approach wasn't very successful either. The planners were interested in strict compliance with the numerical standards. We recognised that we needed to change our tactical approach. Rather than a confrontational approach emerging from a default reaction that planning codes restrict creative expression, we began to approach planning codes obliquely as a way of moving forward, trying to find openings in order to clear a conceptual space for design creativity. In these 4 projects, we began with a careful reading of the codes, tabulating council requirements in order to locate points of complication. In the pitch roof house, we highlighted the disjunction between council's ideal image and the written code. In the Skylight House, we changed the frame of reference and thereby overcame a previous assumption. In the Semi-Detached House, we looked at definitions in order to locate gaps in the way things are classified, as well as changing the frame of reference. And finally, in the Bondi House, we accepted the codes on face value and used them literally to generate a built form that was not previously imagined by council. Codes are therefore explored for their creative potential and as a vehicle to investigate contemporary architectural concepts. In the pitch roof house, one aspect of the planning codes became the all-encompassing rationale that propelled the design beyond the rational limits of the code's original intent, a form of hyper-rationality. As Joshua Prince Ramos states, a hyper-rational process takes rationality to an absurd level. It transcends all the baggage that normally comes with a rational conclusion to something. Mosman Council is one of the most conservative councils in Sydney. Council planning staff indicated that the site was located in a very sensitive area and that compliance with the code, especially setbacks, view loss, and roofscape, will be important to obtain a planning approval. A major component of the code required pitch roofs, as they were the predominant roof type of the area. This requirement is mentioned 6 times in the DCP under 3 different headings. The code even indicates that council may consider pitch roof forms to extend beyond the maximum building height, where the consistent pitch roof style is an important character element. Our response was to play with the disjunction between council's idealised image of the pitch roof expressed in words and the contemporary interpretation of a pitch roof. We realised by creating a point of complication, or conjuncture, we could comply with the codes and be able to explore contemporary design concepts. We proposed a roofscape that was made up of a series of triangles that not only pitched up, as in a traditional pitch roof, but also pitched down to form a faceted roof plane. The scaling of the triangles was important as we wanted to maintain a scale that was compatible with the neighbouring pitch roofs. This was essential as there was a fine line between creating a roof form that integrated into the suburb's existing roofscape, while at the same time being an invasive modification of a traditional pitch roof. Manipulating the faceted roof plane was not just a contextual or a formalist exercise. Other parameters needed to be addressed: the requirements for northern sunlight and the need to merge the roof with the orthogonal roof plan below it. Surprisingly, the variability of the triangular geometry gave us freedom to push and pull the roof form as required to suit the various parameters. The triangular roof points of the roof align with the points of the orthogonal plan. The ridges and valleys follow the alignment of the sliding doors, so they slide without the use of horizontal transoms. Portions of the triangular roof was left out to allow sunlight into the north-facing courtyard. The most important architectural move during the design process was to continue the logic of the triangular geometry from the roof onto the front and side elevations. The geometry became the basis for articulating openings along the side of the building. The structural beams follow the geometry of the roof, continue down along the facades. We realised that structure could also be a spatial device to organise the external and internal appearance of the house. Structure moves into the realm of ornamentation. The traditional opposition between ornamentation and function, structure and necessity was explored through models. This eventually informed on the detailing of the building. For example, the glass and louvers are detailed to sit slightly forward of the structural beams, as shown in this photograph. Externally, this reduces the beam to a flat surface, given the appearance of weightlessness. Sectional Borswood models showed us that by highlighting diagonal beams, they became a strong graphic device that distorted the perspectival depth of the space. For example, the triangulation of the roof plane continues onto the wall, distorting the horizontal and the vertical plane of the space. The diagonals along the facade elongate the perspectival depth, while the triangulation of the corners flatten the perspectival depth. The plan form was fine-tuned to accentuate the aperspectival space. The kinks in the plan are either aligned with the point or the apex of the triangular openings. The walls meet at the front corners of the house at an obtuse angle to accentuate the flattening effect of the geometry. The kink form also played on the disjunction between council's objectives of the code and the prescriptive requirements. The code required the setback to increase as the wall height increased. On a sloping site, council's prescriptive requirements resulted in a wedding cake form in both plan and section. This has become a common form of new housing in the local area, as can be seen in the following slides. Rather than accepting the prescriptive building form stipulated by council, we splayed the building in plan and elevation. This not only avoided the dreaded wedding cake form, but allowed us to look at the building as a three-dimensional faceted object. You can see from the design process of the pitch roof house, now seemingly benign council code requirements have become a generator of ideas and concepts crucial to the final outcome. The Skylight House plays on council's obsession with returning the front facade to its original appearance. Leichhardt Council is the only council I'm aware of in Sydney that has an in-house lawyer present in planning meetings. The lawyer pointed out that an approval would not be granted unless the facade was rebuilt to the drawings of a heritage architect. After seeking legal advice, we realised that it would be more expedient to defer to Council's demand. We were therefore faced with the problem of how to respond to the historical facade without reducing it to a token gesture. The problem was exacerbated by our decision to change the function of the rooms behind the original facade. The floor plan was flipped. The living spaces were relocated to the top floor to take advantage of the sunlight and views, and the secondary bedrooms were relocated to the ground floor, where light and views were less important. Accepting that we could not directly alter the appearance of the front facade, we decided to shift the visual point of focus to the side elevations. Seizing this opportunity, we decided to express the section of the house in the side elevation. Since we developed the design strategy for the house in section, it would be fitting that it would play an important role in shaping the external appearance of the house. We were surprised that Council were not concerned with the appearance of the side elevations, even though they were relatively visible from the street frontage. Council was only concerned with the heritage architect's drawing of the street elevation. The folded roof plane that delineated the internal spaces and forms a distinct skylight profile became visible from the street and the neighbouring houses. This was explained to Council as a simple cutout along the side elevation that reduced the bulk of the building. Council surprisingly accepted the explanation. The wall and roof cappings read as dark lines highlighting the skylight funnels and downpipes. The detailing of the wall capping and the ridge was an important element for integrating two heterogeneous elements, the side elevation and the facade. The side walls were finished using a stucco render rather than a flat render to continue the differentiation between the front elevation and the side of the house. The height of the new wall capping matches the height of the original parapet of the front veranda. The zinc capping is folded up at an angle of 45 degrees to assist in weatherproofing and to form a small wing-like element. This element continues across the ridge to act as a transition between the corrugated profile of the front roof and the standing seam profile of the rear skylights. It was at the scale of the detail that we were able to reinterpret the historical front facade. The subtlety that was required to work at this scale gave us the ability to position the front and side elevations as equivocal and reciprocating elements. Even though we deferred to Council with the front, we nevertheless wanted to create a building that at first glance may seem to fulfill Council's requirements. But if one was to take a closer look, they would notice that all is not as it seems. In the semi-detached house, we played a game with Council's floor space ratio and the visual impact codes. The client is a merchant banker who wanted maximum return for his investment. He believed the best way to do this was to maximise the floor space. The neighbouring semi established the volume of the proposal, as Council planning codes require semi-detached houses to be mirrored. The floor space ratio code was stringent, so our approach was to maximise the external spaces as they were excluded from Council's calculations. Although we mirrored the enclosure of the building, we added a layer of external spaces around it to dramatically increase the perceived and usable space of the dwelling. We began by removing the existing roof structure and the rear portion of the top floor. The existing sandstone basement and rough cast render base containing the bedrooms was retained. We then grafted a new steel superstructure onto the existing base. The superstructure cantilevers past the base and contains living rooms, kitchen, master bedroom and extensive veranda and courtyard spaces. The kink form of the structure expresses a continuous external circulation linking the street entry to the rear garden below. By positioning the external aluminium louver suite on the outside of the verandas and continuing the roof plane over, we created an interstitial space which dramatically increased the perception of the space while not being classified as floor space. The area of the interstitial space of the house is over 100 square metres, which adds 30% to the overall floor area of the house. The council has since closed this loophole. Decks over 20 square metres are now counted as floor space. The interstitial space helped us to strategise an alternate spatial model for a traditional semi-detached house typology. The space is made up of two operable layers. Each layer offers specific environmental, structural, spatial and aesthetic solutions. Here, aesthetics, sustainable and spatial considerations are inseparable. Council stipulated that the facade cannot be longer than 12 metres without articulation. Council highlighted that window openings, changes in materials, and stepping of the wall plan in plan and section were acceptable forms of articulation. Instead, we proposed horizontal louvers across the 28-metre length of the facade. We found it harder to convince council planners of this than the extensive interstitial spaces, as it involved an aesthetic judgment rather than a problem of classification. The planners were reluctant to support this as they believed it didn't correlate with the built image implied by the code. We highlighted that the code privileged a form of abstraction which relied on a collage montage technique. We suggested that there was another form of abstraction, material abstraction, which could also meet the objectives of the code. We showed and explained images of Herzog and de Meuron's Ricola storage warehouse and Zumthor's shelter for Roman ruins, and finally managed to convince the planners that the two forms of abstraction were difference in degree rather than difference in kind. The two forms of abstraction were not opposites, but could be seen as an extension of each other. Material abstraction emphasizes the capacity of the material to generate effects rather than the intrinsic nature of the material. This will be achieved through detailing and repetition to modulate the scale and intensity of the facade. In the semi-detached house, material abstraction is explored by positioning the horizontal steel members and the louver blades in front of the columns to privilege the horizontal. The edges of the louver blade are detailed to align with the flanges of the PFC. The PFC was painted the same colour as the louver blades to reduce them to the same visual order. The viewer then reads the repetitive horizontal louvers in relationship to the flanges of the horizontal members and experiences the facade as a textural surface. To further reduce the image to an abstraction, scalable elements such as gutters and downpipes were incorporated into the steel beams and columns. In the Bondi House, which has just been approved by Council, the form of the house is a literal interpretation of Council's planning codes. The volume of the house is determined by the maximum permissible height, width and length. The parapet line runs precisely 7 metres above the natural ground level along the length of the building. Where the wall height exceeds 7 metres at the end of the building, the wall tilts back and changes the material so it is classified as part of the roof plane. Bedroom volumes have been inserted within the maximum building envelope, and the gaps between them permit natural light into the centre of the long, narrow space. The Bondi House continues our exploration of material abstraction. Here material abstraction is achieved by translucent glass panels set between closely spaced vertical glazing mullions, which provides the side of the house with diffused natural light. The vertical mullions and the supporting structure are designed to have the same visual order. The elevation of the backyard registers the cross floor of the site and the impact of the envelope control. In the Bondi House, we have accepted the codes on face value, but have used them to generate a building form not previously anticipated by Council. Dr. Stan Fung of University of New South Wales offered the following analysis of our thinking. At one level of thinking, the fight against explicit requirements of the code leads us to focus on the ambiguities in the words of the code or in the relevant methods of reckoning and calculation. At another level of thinking, the fight against implicit preferences of Council led us to form a rhetorical play in which we work with very specific gaps between the denotative, connotative, and metaphoric dimensions of key words, such as my description on abstraction. The crux is to apply a label that links council's design fetishes or values to a design decision or effect. On a third level of thinking, consideration is given to the literal compliance of numerical codes. Here the aim is to give the appearance of total capitulation to the codes, while keeping one's eye firmly on the gap between the intents and the wordings of the codes. These levels of thinking are relatively independent alternatives to each other, and are sometimes pursued simultaneously on an ad hoc basis as situations arise. Once engaged, the thinking is turbocharged by something akin to what Joshua Prince Ramos calls hyper-rationality. The logic of thinking is projected relentlessly in a literal and straightforward way. At the same time, at the level of detailing and structural design, much slower thinking is devoted to giving elegant form to a speedy and merciless hyper-rational logic. Colleagues have commented about the difference between each of our projects and even suggested that they may seem to be designed by a different architect. Even though this may seem the case, some of our projects may be better understood as a part of a series that adjust themselves to local conditions. Clients have been coming to us with one of our projects in mind, and in some cases asking us to duplicate a project. Our strangest request so far was from a developer requesting 6 pitch roof houses in the Hamptons on Long Island, New York. To the dismay of our accountant, we resisted duplicating a previous project. We have instead ended up with several mini-series of mutations. Novel aspects in these buildings are therefore a product of evolution rather than revolution, the result of one existing form combining with another to become something different that meets the demands of a new situation or purpose. As Rashid Musafi says in her book The Function of Form, novel forms emerge when they are infused with different techniques, styles, contexts, or themes. The constraints and the capacity of each base unit are activated by a range of external inputs or materials, such as planning codes, social and cultural circumstances, economic criteria, climatic conditions, or affective desires. The Romero houses are a mutation of the semi-detached house. The client for the Romero house engaged us after reading an article about the semi-detached house in Monument magazine. They wanted to duplicate the semi-detached house as they were proposing a new semi-detached development on their site. The Romero houses are located in the same local council as the pitch roof house. The main triggers for the mutation were the conservation streetscape and changes in the environmental rating tool, BASIX. The tug of war with the client started early in the design process. We initially presented the sketch design to the client without a central courtyard to address their tight budget. The client was very upset as the semi-detached house had a courtyard and they believed that their development would not be the same without it. They also wanted to keep the horizontal louvers, dark grey exterior and end decks. We did, however, convince them to explore an alternate roof form. We explained that unlike the semi-detached house, where the roof form needed to mirror the neighbouring semi, we now had the opportunity to build a completely new roofscape. We played a similar game with the roofscape as we did in the pitch roof house, but because the site is located on a conservation streetscape, it resulted in a different solution. The roof form is designed as a series of connecting gables reflecting the predominant roof type of the area. We developed a strategy in section, where the interconnecting gables are experienced internally as a folded roof plane that zigzags down the site. We integrated split-level floor plates into the section to prevent the rear portion of the house from breaching the maximum wall height. From across Mossman Bay, the roofscape is designed to contextually sit beside the Federation gables and pitch roofs of its neighbour, without ever compromising its contemporary language. Council preferred dark colours, and so did we. This is my favourite photograph of the development. The Harbour Bridge and the Romero houses amongst a sea of terracotta roofs. From the street, the dwellings were designed to continue the step form of the neighbouring houses. We've reinterpreted the traditional gable as two louvered west-facing skylight funnels pitched towards the street. Changes to Basic meant that we had to reduce the amount of glass in our designs. We couldn't replicate the layered facade of the semi-detached house as it required too much glass. We had to develop a new facade system that considered the inclusion of solid walls and also took into account the split-level arrangement of the houses. The aim was to explore the effective potential of integrating solid sections into a louvered facade to elicit a singular and clearly defined expression. We developed a system of solid and translucent horizontal banding along the facade, which disguises the location of the split floor plates, courtyards and decks. The banding provides a scaleless and consistent graphic device across the exterior of the building. The louvers are detailed flush with the solid bands, hiding the internal supporting columns. This privileges the horizontal and heightens the sense of lightness. Internally, the bands are experienced as horizontal windows that provide visual continuity along the length of the space, despite the irregular roof form and the step floor plates. This can be seen in the next few slides. The next series of houses began in 2001 as an exploration of the suburban house typology on a 375 square metre site. The precedents for the project was Bernard Schumy's La Villette, a 550,000 square metre urban park. The Surtees house had a complex brief and an unusual site allotment. The new house was built in the backyard of this existing dwelling. Unlike most suburban sites, the new house doesn't have a street frontage. The allotment is flat, introverted and without views. We started by examining the default suburban house typology. The typical suburban house is designed as an object located in the middle of the site, with small side setbacks, a single orientation to the backyard. Internal circulation is usually along the length of the site. We wanted to explore an alternate strategy that would integrate the house into the landscape, where the side boundaries, rear garden and the interior of the house was incorporated into the overall site strategy. We looked at La Villette as a precedence, as it offered a strategy that would extend the experience of the house across the whole site. The site was imagined as an abstracted ground plane similar to La Villette. We separated the Surtees house into 8 organising and spatial layers that extend the perceived boundaries of the house beyond its enclosing walls. Unlike La Villette, the layers are mediated layers and not imagined as autonomous layers. As such, the layers were fine-tuned to merge with each other during the design process. The first layer is a perimeter hedge planning that forms a spatial element that encloses the site and provides privacy to the ground plane. A lily-pilly planting hedge along the side and back boundaries and giant bamboo planting along the subdivision line form the perimeter enclosure. These extend the perceived enclosure of the house to the boundaries of the site. The second layer is a tiling and planting pattern that reinforces the ground as an abstracted landscape element stretching across the whole site. This extends the ground plane beyond the enclosure of the house. The tiling strips align with the edges of the cores and the base of the steel columns. The third layer is a series of glass sliding doors that delineate the actual enclosure of the house. They are arranged around a north-facing courtyard. The doors are able to open from the corners and be configured in multiple combinations and permutations to allow a variety of circulation patterns across the whole site. The fourth layer is a series of cores containing a powder room, kitchen, bar and staircase that spatially delineates the ground plane. The cores are clad in timber veneer, so they are interpreted as joinery items, disguising the fact that the cores also act as load-bearing elements. We arranged the cores to encourage circulation patterns and spaces to flow and orientate not only along the site, but also across the site. When you enter the house, you're obliged to turn several times around the cores. The view of the garden and living spaces gradually unfold with each turn. This type of planning departs from a traditional suburban house layout by offering a systematic multiple paths along the ground plane, rather than a singular defined corridor. The fifth layer is a number of gum trees that were planted in the garden to act as a high-level screening device at the rear of the house. Spatially, the new trees visually extend the experience of the site beyond the planting hedge, out towards the canopy of the neighbouring trees. A Japanese maple tree was positioned in the centre of the house. The client specified the tree specially to register the change in seasons. The sixth layer is a series of curtains that follow the alignment of the enclosure. Depending on the arrangement, the curtains modulate the degree of enclosure of each space, and the enclosure's relationship with the garden, as well as other spaces across the courtyard. This addressed the client's brief for a continuous space that could also be compartmentalised. The final conceptual layer is the bedroom volume, which floats above the abstracted ground plane. The Freshwater House is a mutation of the Surtees House. The clients for the Freshwater House visited the Surtees House and wanted to replicate the planning as it provided adaptable and permeable living spaces. The triggers that mutated the Surtees House into the final Freshwater House design were the topography of the site, ocean views, the public nature of the site, and the planning precedents set up by the neighbouring properties. The site slopes up from the street frontage and has a steep crossfall. This enables the house on the site to view not only back over the street frontage, but also over the side of the neighbouring houses. Council had recently approved 2 new houses on either side of the property that dealt with the sloping site by designing a podium to artificially level the site. We continued the podium into our design as it provided a solution that would help us adapt the Surtees house to the sloping site. The design of the Freshwater House had to address the double orientation and the northern sun. The service cores were repositioned from the Surtees House to respond to this. The planning strategy was flexible and easily modified to suit the specific new site conditions. In section, the design was therefore made up of 3 distinct horizontal parts, each with their own particular spatial experience. The podium excavated into the slope is deliberately cavernous and dark. It contains a garage and living space and aligns with the podiums of the neighbouring properties as required by council. The living space is sandwiched between the podium and the underside of the horizontal volume. It's a horizontal void, transparent, almost invisible, full of light, half inside, half outside. And finally, the top veiled volume is a serene, translucent space for sleeping. The detailing of the floating volume differs from the Surtees House to the Freshwater House. They directly respond to the different site conditions and a different structural system, resulting in 2 completely different interpretations. In the Surtees House, the edges of the bedroom floor slab are folded up to form a composite concrete and steel beam. The beam is constructed of a 1/2 metre high fabricated steel channel. The hybrid beam enables the floor slab to span up to 8 metres between the columns. The top of the sliding doors and the curtains continue past the ceiling level to connect with the bottom edge of the steel channel, so that they cannot be seen from inside of the house. Externally, the viewer reads the thin edge of the flange against the scallop of the steel beam. The shadow created by the scallop enables you to read the exterior as 2 stacked volumes. The heavily engineered beam is therefore detailed to appear light. The steel roof structure sits within the depth of the louvered pelmet. A proprietary retractable louver system which modulates the sunlight and provides privacy to the bedroom volume sits between the pelmet and the top of the steel beam. In the Freshwater House, we were unable to use an off-the-shelf horizontal louver system like the Surtees House, due to the higher wind ratings required at the beachfront location. We instead designed a custom-made screen. This had a direct impact on the detailing and the appearance of the bedroom volume. Anodized aluminium sections were chosen for the screens. The battens were arranged vertically rather than horizontally as in the Surtees House, to privilege the vertical dimension of the view so the occupant can view the sand, ocean and sky simultaneously. The spacing of the vertical battens was very important to the overall effect of the screen. A number of prototypes were made on site with battens at different sizes and at different spacings. This process was very important to finally tune the balance between view and privacy and to attain an appropriate level of translucency. When closed, the balconies along the perimeter of the bedroom volume function as an interstitial space. Unlike the Surtees House, the horizontal beams are not expressed, where the shutters are closed. The top and bottom of the shutters extend up past the steel roof beams and down past the floor structure. When the shutters are closed, the viewer therefore only reads two fine horizontal plates infilled by the shutters. The running gear for the shutters is hidden in the top beam, and the guide rail is recessed into the bottom beam. As the shutter opens, the structural system of the building is revealed. When fully open, the battens that make up the shutters are designed to line up with each other, forming a figurative T at the corner of the building, a play on Mies van der Rohe's cruciform corner detail. By adjusting the motorised bifold shutters, the occupants can directly control and modulate the amount of privacy, enclosure, sunlight and also frame views. By tuning the internal spaces, the occupant also modulates the external appearance of the house. Externally, the house represents the occupant's mediation of the environment. Here, representation is intrinsic to the form of the building, rather than gestures that an architect stylistically composes and applies on the facade. As the occupants can stop and start the shutters in any position, the appearance of the house can have a multitude of permutations and combinations and therefore isn't completely scripted by the architect. Following the same logic of the batten screens, we decided to line the podium wall with vertical timber battens, which continue up to form the handrail. We chose timber battens as they will weather differently to the aluminium sections of the bifold shutters. Over time, the timber battens will grey naturally, while the aluminium battens will remain crisp and pristine. The clients were originally concerned that the timber handrail will block the views of the beach, and worse still, look like a picket fence. They proposed frameless glass balustrades instead. We were concerned that the glass would compromise their privacy, and therefore we arranged for the builder to make prototypes of various batten arrangements, and realised that if the battens were arranged at certain angles, with every second batten cut down, we could maintain both view and privacy. The clients chose to angle the battens to privilege the view from the kitchen. The final mutation of the series is the Bondi House. This is a new project which we are currently working on. Since we have won an award for the Freshwater House, clients now come to us thinking we only design beach houses and oceanfront houses, or houses of a similar aesthetic. We have found it very difficult to adapt the Freshwater House to this site. The site is located on top of a cliff face facing the ocean. The proposed model kept the courtyard form of the Freshwater House, but added solid walls due to the increased basic requirements and privacy concerns from an overlooking neighbouring apartment building. The floating bedrooms is positioned between the side walls, which became an important element in the reconceptualisation of the house. Parts of the bedroom volume were pulled back from the side walls to create light shafts. A curvilinear geometry was employed to orientate the bedroom lenses to the sun and view. Unlike the Surtees House and the Freshwater House, where the bedroom levels were supported by columns, in the Bondi House, the bedroom level is supported by side walls which scallop in deform the first floor cantilever. Even though the client wanted to replicate the Freshwater House, with each presentation meeting we highlighted the constraints of the house and were able to mutate the Freshwater House beyond recognition. It was a long but essential process. If we had presented the final scheme in our first meeting, I don't believe the clients would have accepted it. The fact that we were able to demonstrate an evolutionary process through a series of models meant that the client was able to partake in the process and develop a sense of ownership with the final design. By way of conclusion, I offer you another quotation from Stan Fung. The logic of loopholes highlight the opportunistic nature of design as performance. It is outward looking towards attendant forces, social, legal and otherwise, beyond our control. The logic of mutations is played out over a broader temporal framework and allows difference and repetition to be played out over a number of years in the life of an office. In other words, both kinds of logic allow a place for conventional values of a profession, such as fine detailing, but do not give them priority over other forces at play. Both kinds of logics are concerned with clearing a conceptual space for design creativity without ever signing over substantial portions of initiative to eye-catching developments in computer software. Thank you.
Now, traditionally, after two of these series, we have questions. So, does anyone have any questions for Tony? You can come out of the shadow.
Okay.
I'll go and start. So, any questions? Criticisms? Tony, I was going to ask. Oh, sorry. Yep, at the back.
Just going to ask, do you find, you talk about the interpretation of words within the DA process, do you find that you're engaging that early in the process, or is it you end up in appeal and it's only that in the appeal that really gets really heard?
We do it quite early in the process, and we've become quite familiar with the codes at different councils in Sydney, so we know, if a house is located in a particular council, we know what sort of games to play. But we do it quite early. Even when we present the sketch design to council, we sort of employ those sort of games at the very beginning. So I think if you leave it later on, I think this is sort of too late, because I'm not sure how the Victorian system works, but we don't have an appeal system in the state of New South Wales. The appeal system is normally the Land Environment Court, and by that time the client spent an awful lot of money with lawyers and expert witnesses, so we try to avoid that.
Yeah, Fiona.
Yeah. So you have a lot of clients that come to you and say, we want the same as that project. What's your initial response to them?
We smile, and I can understand why. I mean, clients come to you for different things, and I think they feel a certain degree of safety or a certain degree of knowing what they're going to get when they refer to a previous scheme. I guess the opposite side of the coin to that is that we've also lost clients because our projects are so different from each other, and that they would rather go to another architect because the other architect designs the same house over and over and over again. I think it really depends on how adventurous the client is and how much surety the client wants. Some clients don't want to be left naked, not knowing what they're going to get, and I sort of understand where they're coming from, but we sort of by stealth try to sort of mutate the project, because I generally kind of find it quite boring just repeating the same thing over and over again, so that's something which we try to do.
Yeah, Patrick.
I was just wondering, you seem to draw so much sort of innovation and enjoyment out of the constraints of a project. You sort of take on the constraints in such a positive way, which is very sort of inspiring for me to see.
Yeah.
But I was really interested to know, do you sort of have a dream about working in an unconstrained way? And if you did, what how would you play the game in that environment?
There was an example. We had a job in the Southern Highlands where it was in a natural landscape, something which Glenn Murcutt or Peter Stutchfield would really revel in, and I found that quite difficult to design in because where do you start your opening move? You can respond to the sunlight, you can respond to the site conditions, but I found that I was sort of drifting here and there, unable to make a decision, and I felt quite uneasy. It's quite a strange thing, but I find constraints in some way much easier to work in. It's a bit like designing a house for yourself. I mean, Stephanie and myself, we're designing a terrace house in Surrey Hills, and when you're designing a house for yourself and you're the client and the architect, you sort of sit there watching TV saying, shall we do this? Shall we do that? Shall we do this? No, I want to do this. No, I want to do this. You don't have the client telling you, no, I want this, and then that's it, and you just have to find a way of dealing with that. So we generally find it much easier, surprisingly, designing with constraints. I guess it limits the possibilities, limits the choices, and it forces you to focus your attention in a certain direction. I find it quite difficult working without constraints. I don't think there is ever a situation where there isn't any constraints, but when there are very few, we do find it quite difficult.
Yep.
When they changed that code because you'd beaten them, couldn't they see the benefit of what you designed? Why did they do that?
No, I think people have different takes on things, and town planners are generally conservative people, and for them, for town planners, it's very much applying sort of abstract codes to a specific site condition, and they're very much concerned about the size or the bulk of the house and its effect on the neighbouring properties. There's a public value to the code there. It's something which they seem to have a default sort of reaction where the bigger the building, the worse the building is, and that loophole was closed up quite quickly. Not because of us. There were other architects doing it in a different manner. So I can't pat myself on the back and say I've changed it, but we've changed it. But
I suppose the question is about them understanding that you can interpret some of the prosaic conditions in a more creative way. That they couldn't see the good, or they couldn't see the benefit in some of that.
No, because they don't know how to interpret the image or the building. Unfortunately, they don't have the sort of design education that architects do.
But couldn't your house become a new typology for? Couldn't you see a
could.
picture of it in a future planning code? I'm joking.
Yeah. No, I mean, it'd be horrible to have that repeated all that, but no, they're very much divorced, from the process. They approve something, and then they don't look back at what they approved. They don't look at the results of their approval system.
So the codes aren't really evolving. Your houses were evolving each time, but the code is a static thing, sort of stuck in time.
It is stuck in time, but every year certain clauses get tightened up.
Yeah.
And it's always tightened up. It's a very negative way of looking at things. But strangely, certain things, other loopholes get opened up. Quite recently, the State Labor Party, before they lost government, passed this regulation that voids across all councils would not be included in the floor space ratio for houses. And it's quite an amazing sort of turnaround. I think their argument was that why should somebody who has a sloping site be penalised for having split levels or having staircases? They thought it was a fairer thing. That loophole, the voids, we actually utilised in the Bondi House, because it's very much the volume is very much 50% void and 50% floating bedrooms. So they don't often just tighten up close, cut the loopholes. There are other things which open up at the same time. So,
Kirsten.
I just had more a comment actually. You said that that comment about people coming to you and wanting in part the comfort of consistency or knowing what they might get, and so hence the repeat. But actually, and your comment that the work is so different, and I was just thinking that you have actually an amazing consistency of thinking, and certainly your theme of mutation is testament to that. That there's a methodology, if you like, a palette, a sort of formal repertoire, but obviously that produces some quite different and distinctive outcomes. But I think to your credit, tonight is a very good presentation of how an office has its own, if you like, sometimes I describe them as blind spots, and these things that we inevitably do in our repertoire without necessarily being as aware as someone looking outside of them might be, that there's some kind of continuity of thought that happens across a number of projects. So I was just interested in your description of it as so.
The thought process is consistent, and that's something which we want to maintain in the office. I guess Stephanie and I, we've always admired Herzog and de Meuron as a firm, and even in their work, there's a consistency in thinking, even though the object or the building is quite different, and that's something which we find exciting. It's the variety or the possibility and the difference which can be the outcome of a consistent line of thinking. And there are some people which I guess Herzog de Meuron would be probably the best example of doing that sort of having that sort of process. You get companies like Sana, which are quite different. They're producing a similar type of work with a similar thought process and adapting it to different parts of the world, for example, different climatic conditions. So but anyway, that consistent thinking we'd like to sort of continue on.
Tony, I was going to ask about Sydney generally, because it's been very much a Sydney context for planning, and the regulations and the codes seem to want to constantly control, and you said they want to constantly tighten it. So is there an unspoken agreement amongst all of these municipalities to somehow limit development as a way of Sydney not becoming more dense, or is there some economic rationale? Because the regulations are labyrinthine. They ensure that the process of achieving a building is long,
difficult,
and extended, and that invariably a client, particularly for a residential commission, has to outlay an enormous amount of time and patience and money. What do you think? And this is interesting because it's preoccupied Sydney architects ever since Harry Seidler started practicing in Sydney. Sydney Anchor, they always have bemoaned the state of planning in Sydney. And do you think that I don't quite get it? I don't think it's the same atmosphere here.
No, I heard it's quite different here, and I think it comes down to the conservative nature of the the constituents, the people who live in the council. The codes are very much a product of their reaction, and I think codes are quite reactionary in that the codes are benefit or lean towards the objector rather than the applicant.
Right.
And you get councillors who get voted into council on the platform of being anti-development, and they get voted in on that platform, and then the next thing they do is that they employ a new company, a new town planning company, to redraw their codes because they come in on that platform, and increasingly you get a lot of independent mayors or green mayors, which aren't sort of affiliated to Labor or Liberal, and they come in on an anti-development platform. And you can understand where they're coming from. They're there to restrict development and to restrict the size and the bulk of the development and the density. But I think the way the codes are written is that it reduces everything to a common denominator. and it in some ways stifles design excellence.
Mm.
I'm not sure whether they understand that.
No, but it seems to be a self-regulating form of control and a slowing process, whereas if things were more relaxed, would things really get out of hand?
I don't think. Yeah, I don't think so. But also it comes about, the property values in Sydney are just increasing, at a rapid rate, and you get certain, objectives have quite a, they can lobby councillors quite well, and you get the situation where, people would object, or a neighbour would object to an applicant's plan through their lawyer. So they wouldn't actually go and knock on a door and say, I object because of such and such thing. They would actually straight away employ a lawyer and employ an independent town planner or consultant town planner, and they would send letters to council. So, it's all quite, serious and sort of expensive stuff. I'm not sure why they do that in Sydney. Maybe they do it in Melbourne too, but generally the more affluent the area is, the harder it is to get things through council.
Right. Well, any final questions for Tony? Yes.
The Skylight House. I was intrigued by the fact that the front building was demolished and it's been restored back to its original. In that process, how clinical were you in actually restoring it to the Heritage Architect's specification, and where did you, where were the points where a line was drawn between not going with their certain elements?
So council only wanted the elevation drawing from the Heritage Architect. So we hired Clive Lucas Stapleton. We said to them, only draw the elevation and nothing else. And council, approved that. And I mean, Clive, he basically went on site, photographed all the sort of castings, and when we demolished, we the builder was very careful in basically taking the castings and storing it in a safe place. And so we basically, restored it back, to the existing facade, or even better than the existing facade, because Clive had his own take on certain things, even down to the degree, to the moulding around the windows, even though the windows were replaced in the 70s. So what Clive did was basically walk up and down the street and take photographs and take measured drawings of the neighbouring houses. So we basically had to do that. Council wasn't concerned, and Clive, always chuckles at it. He always, he had no impact on the inside of what was behind the facade. So, the difficulty was trying to bring the two together, and we struggled at that. And that design took about a year to sort of work out. We looked up people like Carlos Scarpa and how he did it, and because we didn't want the facade just to be sort of left as a token gesture or as a skin, where the interior has just been taken out. So it was a long and arduous process, but the front facade we basically had to do what the Heritage Architect wanted us to do.
Look, I'd like to thank, on everyone's behalf, Tony Chenchow for a fantastic lecture this evening, and I think Robin Boyd would have been very proud, because many of his clients and external critics considered that every house he did was different, and I think there's no shame in it. So, Tony, thank you very much.
Thank you.